Welcome. What is philosophy? That's the question of the day. In order to answer this question, we have an outline for this video and we will talk through it. We won't go through everything that's in this handout. Essentially, I'm not going to read the handout to you. That would be, a waste of everyone's time. But I will go through each of these sections of this handout so that hopefully hearing it set to a voice will clarify things that when you're reading it, you may not initially see or understand. And so we'll go through a series of questions, the historical extent that we are covering throughout the semester while we think about what philosophy is. We'll talk about constructing a working definition of philosophy, the definition that's not meant to be the final definition of it, just that should be able to serve our purposes throughout this semester. As well as we'll talk about wonder and the role it plays in philosophy, as well as argumentation. We'll talk about the search for truth and how that functions inside most of philosophy, and these various ways of seeing the world that are very important when one's learning, trying to make sense of what a particular philosophy person or non philosophy person is trying to argue for. And then the pros and cons of studying philosophy. First, the questions. After you sign up for a class like this one, or any class actually, you should always be able to answer these kind of questions about that class. If you can answer them and understand or find answers to them and understand those answers, you're way ahead of the curve. Like you could ask any of these about philosophy, history, biology, literature, whatever academic or technical subject that you happen to be taking as a class. You can always ask a set of questions like this, and it's beneficial to do so. Well, first of all, the first question is, what is the historical extent of philosophy? How long has this discipline been going on? And what is philosophy? Just a general definition. What do philosophy people do in general and on a daily basis? What, if anything, is the overall goal? What's the point of all of it? There's a lot of people working very hard and have been, as far as Western philosophy goes, for at least 2,500 years. Well, what are they after? What are they searching for? And then why or why not study it? You can always ask that of any field. There'll be pros and cons. That it's worthwhile. You can go on the internet and search for answers to these kind of questions. Those answers may not be the same as what we talk about or is written in this handout or this video. And that's because philosophy people all approach things a little differently. None of us are exactly the same. And so there's variations among how some philosophy people would define the field. There's variations between how some would say what the goal of it is. Well, the goal for our purposes in this handout, this video, is just to develop some kind of working fixed definition that we can use throughout the semester. This will be our way of defining it. And then at the end of the semester, you can look back at this video or this handout and see how successful what we started with is these definitions and answers to these questions. How accurate are they? Was something missed? Etc. When inside philosophy, everything can be talked about and discussed. Definitions and answers to questions are not permanent forever. That's just an aspect to keep in mind. So these answers are in no way the final word. And moreover, my answers are to these kind of questions that we'll be answering in this video. My answers are just trying to capture these characteristics of what is sometimes referred to as Western philosophy. There's also Eastern philosophy. There's also philosophy that's different than both of those two things. But we're in the sort of North American, West Europe side of the planet, and that's the kind of philosophy that we tend to have introduction to philosophy courses about. But there are many other classes in philosophy that focus more on Asian or Arabic or South American. There's tons of other kinds of philosophy that takes a different perspective of things. But what we're focused on this class is like Western philosophy practitioners that happen to live from 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece up to those living right now in the US and Europe and Australia and Canada, places like that. What is the historical extent of philosophy? Well, this is just a rough and ready way to think about what we'll be covering. It's a lot to try to accommodate from 2,500 years to present day. And so, but the eras that we will step off into is like we have ancient Greece, we have the Roman Empire, we have the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the various scientific revolutions that happened from like England going into what is today the United States. We have the Enlightenment era as well as the Industrial Revolutions. And then the World Wars, the Cold War era, and then the modern and contemporary world, or what some would say is a postmodern world. That we will see examples of philosophy people and their argumentation and the historical context of what was going on, just a brief glimpses of the historical context, but still it's necessary to have some of it to remotely understand what these people's concerns were and what motivated them, what were they thinking about in order to understand what their claims, why they're asking the questions they're asking, why they're answering those questions the way they are, and what their evidence and reasons for those answers were. You need some of the historical context. A little bit goes a long way. And so there is this timeline. This document it develops, and we'll see it right here. This timeline document, you can find it. There's a link to it inside this week's module. And it is something I have worked on in classes, previous classes have added to. It has been going on for years. That's why it's a long timeline. And it is in no way meant to be complete. It doesn't account for every single era in history that could be noted that's worth noting, nor does it account for every single philosophy person or every historically significant individual or piece of technology. Indeed, you can add to this in one of the first extra credits. You can add your contribution to it, and you'll be able to see that when you look at extra credit throughout the semester. But this timeline, like to give a sense of the scale of what we'll be covering, like you're starting out with the Minoan civilizations. That's definitely a long time back. We will be talking about a little of this, but more in terms of like the Greek pantheon, their gods, their goddesses, their world spirits, just to get a feel for that, so that then we can get into and the impacts of like these various wars, what it meant to the Greek peoples, as well as we will be looking at quite a bit of these Hesiod, Homer. We will encounter some of that. But there's also, if you look at this timeline, there's Aesop. If you've ever read any Aesop's fables, you've very likely seen some of them through various movies and cartoons, and you may not have known it. But they're still in play today. And you can see the way that this timeline works is you have the dates, and the BC you could name the way the dating convention works is that everything BC counts down to 0 and everything AD counts up from 0. So these dates are getting lower numerically until we get to the year 0, and then it starts counting back up. So some of the people we will encounter is like Heraclitus, definitely, Parmenides, Anaxagoras, we will encounter them. Empedocles, no doubt. Definitely Socrates and Democritus and Aristophanes. All of these people were significant and are kind of what you expect to encounter in an introduction to philosophy class. If you're looking at Western philosophy, that the Greeks are the start of the Western world, ancient Greek civilization. And so you go from there and you end all the way up to where we are today. And so we have Plato. Then as we move forward, you end up in the Greco-Roman era. This is when your Rome is starting to gain power. Then you end up with the skepticism, which we will encounter that this semester, as well as some of these emperors and the impact that they had, like the Roman Empire. That's when you end up with the start of Christianity with Jesus and the apostles. And we will discuss some of that. It's necessary to be familiar with some of that in order to understand what the medieval philosophy people are even up to, as well as to get a sense of what happened right ahead of what we consider to be the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, like the transition period from the fall of the Western Roman Empire up until the moment that universities started being reestablished. There's a period of 400 or 500 years in there that matters and to understand, because it sets the stage for why the Middle Ages went the way it did in the Middle Age philosophy. So you have, standard things like Trajan's Roman Emperor. We'll read something, actually a few sentences from Trajan this semester. And Pliny the Younger. That's also who we'll read in the context of the Emperor Trajan. Then you're ending up in what's sometimes known as the patristic era. This is the era where you have the early Christian church, what's sometimes referred as the early Christian church fathers. These are the people that basically established the canon. You end up with, soon enough we'll get to it, but in around 400 we'll see St. Augustine. We'll talk about some of his work, read some of it. There's also, but before you get to him, you have Galen, which is where your much of the medicine comes from, or Roman medicine that was collected together from the Greeks and the Romans and the surrounding cultures. So there's that. And you can just go through this timeline. There's no reason to spend a lot of time looking at it in this video. But see, there's St. Augustine of Hippo. We will certainly read some of his work. It's very necessary if one's going to talk about, anything to do with the Middle Ages or the build up to it. And we're in AD now. The years are counting upwards. They're getting higher in the timeline. And you have the moment when Rome was sacked. And this was a very significant moment for St. Augustine and the Christian world at the time. And because not long after it, as you notice, 410 and 476, you've got, it's kind of, you can pick different dates for when the Western Roman Empire kind of fell, but this is one that's standardly accepted. You have to pick somewhere. You could pick a year before or 10 years before. You could pick 10 years after. But this is a pretty common date one encounters. And this had a tremendous impact on the Western world, because that's the beginning of your Dark Ages, your early Middle Ages, Dark Ages. And then we need to get clear about that. Like, what does it mean to be a Dark Age? The simple answer is there's just not as much writing and records. It's dark to us in that we can't see clearly in that time and understand as nearly as much as we can in the times before, during the Western Roman Empire in its heyday, or the European Middle Age period after things stabilized after the Dark Ages. So it really just means we can't see as much. We don't know as much. But we do know some, and it's worth mentioning that when we get to it. There's also in this timeline, you'll see things like various works of literature that you may have encountered before. If you ever wondered when was that occurring, what is the context? What's happening around it? That'll be mentioned as we go along. There's your Age of the Vikings, your Carolingian dynasty. There's your 1001 Arabian Nights. There's many other things. I mean, there's the establishment of Kievan Rus, which eventually became Rus and is today, the Russian Federation. It's interesting. There's a very, very interesting history of all of Eastern Europe. There's also the High Middle Ages. This is when we get into what's known as scholasticism, medieval scholasticism. We will talk about some of the argumentation that was going on at that point in time. There's also, you can see the Crusades. This is not every one of the Crusades either, by the way. These are some of the sub-Crusades, and one kingdom's going to fight in the Holy Lands. A lot of that. All of this is relevant to understanding why people were philosophically focused on what they were focused on, why they were arguing the way they were, why the questions that they were concerned about, why they were concerned about them, things like that. Then we're getting into the beginning right here with Dante. Dante with his Inferno and De Monarchia. That is when there's kind of a shift that's taking place in many things, like in the spiritual sphere of what people were believing, as well as the socio-political spheres, and as well as in philosophy and in literature. Things were changing by the time of Dante's era. It was moving toward what eventually became known as the Renaissances. There was Italian Renaissance, French, etc. The Italian Renaissance is what most people encounter when they encounter this notion of Renaissance, of rebirth, rediscovery of typically works from Greek and ancient Greece, classical Greece, and Rome. Various art forms, you end up with a lot more Plato works show up in this time. People would gain more access to those things than they had before. And that makes a significant difference on the way people are thinking. There's also the rise of the big banks are happening at this time in finance. In very early sort of in the Western European world of capitalism. And all of that's starting to exist and solidify. And that happens all the way up to modern day, some of that, or the present. And so we will definitely look at some people from the Renaissance, some philosophy people, because they changed things tremendously from the way people were conceptualizing the world and the human's place in the world and the universe. And so we definitely, with anything to do with the Medici, you cannot talk about the Italian Renaissance without thinking about the Medici and the Borgia, like Rodrigo Borgia, that was Pope, and his sons and daughters, daughter. It was, all of that's very significant, and it all matters for what eventually turns into the and definitely Machiavelli. The Renaissance wouldn't be complete without saying something about Machiavelli. But there's also that the Borgia popes, the Medici popes, all of that leads up to what eventually turns into the Protestant Reformation. And the scientific revolution also shows up soon in the wings of all this. That makes a big difference to how philosophy people are thinking and the questions they're asking, the argumentation that they're crafting. The whole worldview is changing tremendously at this point in history with the scientific revolution. Things that were assumed to be true and just by default had to be true were starting to be questioned at this time. I mean, we have come at this point 2,000 years from the ancient Greeks, and the worldviews and the mentalities of people, at least in terms of the writers, the thinkers, the politicians, their minds were changing about things for a lot of reasons, not just philosophical reasons, but many others. Yeah, and then there's the Protestant Reformation, and immediately tons and tons of wars of religion for well over 100 years. The Protestant versus the Catholics. Then you have the Catholic Counter-Reformation. The sides of the wars get set. And then we're ending up in the middle of this scientific revolution. A lot of it, a person can see early examples of like scientific methods and procedures back in the 1350s, but it really was written down and became popularized by someone like Francis Bacon, which we will see some of his stuff. And note that the very beginnings of kind of writing down and solidifying a kind of scientific method, a scientific or empirical way of thinking about the world and humans' place in it, is happening at the exact same time as Shakespeare, as well as Galileo. Very interesting time in Western European history and Western philosophy. You also have King James that did the English translation, the King James Version of the Bible that many people still use to this day. I mean, you have everybody from Kepler to William Harvey on this timeline. And it's worth just seeing things. So, and having this timeline, it's a large document, like 48 pages at this point. It'll only get larger as the semesters keep going and people in the class contribute to it, as well as I continuously add to it. And this gives a person a way that if you ever hear of one of these historical people, you can print out or save a copy of this timeline and use it, for years on, well after this class. For your other classes, if you're taking history classes or literature classes, and you ever wonder who was around, what was going on at that time, knowing history, although it may not be something that's emphasized too heavily in a lot of our middle schools and high schools in the Western world, or at least in the United States, it is invaluable for kind of understanding why things are the way they are today, how they moved into the places we are today. It's not just a matter of events happening at certain dates and times. It's a matter of whole ways of thinking about life and the world and what really matters, what's valuable, what we should be working toward, what we should be avoiding. All of those kind of moral ideas, those things are changing as we move through all these people. And for example, here's Rene Descartes. We will certainly see some of his writing during this semester. There's also the rise of the Dutch East India Company. That's one of your first publicly traded companies with stock. I mean, it's arguable. You could talk about there's banks that eventually, and mining too, but this is just one of the ones that's often noticed is like your first kind of stock-based company. Interesting. And at this point, we're in the U.S. Like we well past when the nation started sending ships of people over to the New World. And also that, just thinking of those dates like 1492, 1500, when the New World is discovered by the Europeans, doesn't mean that other people weren't already on this landmass in what is today the United States or the North America part with the U.S. and Canada. It does not mean that other people hadn't already found the land. It just means that the New World is when the Europeans really started, the Western Europeans with like Spain, France, England, places like that started sending people and explorers finding it. And so we're 100 years after that period in time. And so there's the westward migration in North America. All of that's happening at this time. You also have Robert Boyle. We will encounter some of his stuff along with Newton this semester. And you have just on and on, like there's Newton. And you have, the golden age of piracy. If you ever wondered when was piracy actually a big thing as far as Western Europe, well, it's listed on this. Doesn't mean that piracy didn't happen before 1615. No, there was piracy all the way back in ancient Greece. But in terms of what we see, like the pirates on the ships, and things like that, that when we're talking about various like Blackbeard the pirate, things like that, this is the era they're referring to, 1650 typically. Then we're in the Age of Enlightenment. This made a tremendous impact on philosophy, science, politics, social arrangements, cultures, morality. Tremendous amounts of things changed and transformed during this period of time. And we will encounter Immanuel Kant that wrote a short little essay on what is enlightenment. We will encounter that this semester. There's also David Hume, tremendously important. We will read some of his stuff this semester. Immanuel Kant, we will read some of his stuff. That's what is enlightenment. That's also the notion of perception and philosophy of mind. There's also your early founders of the U.S., Washington, Adams, Jefferson, all the names that everyone in this class will have at least heard. You also have the European Industrial Revolution. This made a tremendous impact on what people were thinking about. This changed the whole family dynamic, urban environments, so much changed. This became when people were truly able to build a company and become just crazy rich and have resources and be able to build items that normally would have taken 3 people their entire lifetimes could not have built what could be pushed out of a factory in a month. I mean, it's just huge changes to society, culture, philosophy, everything. And then we just keep going. I'm not going to go much further with this timeline, but either way, it goes all the way the United States Constitution, the French Revolution. We will touch upon lots of these events throughout history and the philosophy people associated with it. Thomas Carlyle, we'll see some of his stuff this semester. And you can look through this timeline. It just gives you a feel. I mean, we can go all the way down to the end just so people see that, yes, indeed, it goes all the way to things like the various more recent wars, from Gulf Wars, Soviet Union, the fall of it, when the European Union's created, when the World Wide Web, internet actually is available, but it doesn't really start to take off until these eras. Like, I was alive and fully remember when there was no internet that people worked with. There were no classes like this one. You know, I was there. I was around and took some of the very first online classes that existed. Everything from when Google comes about, as well as the 9/11 attacks, all the way into contemporary Russo-Ukrainian wars and this new multipolar world, which people may or may not have heard of that, but that is a real thing. And that's the sort of era that things will be different going forward, at least in regards to the Western world and Eastern Europe and China and the various countries. But that's just a kind of preview of the timeline. And we are hopping all the way from ancient Greece down to contemporary. As long as we have enough time. We may not make it there perfectly, but we're striving to get there. So what is our approach? Well, it's like it's described in this handout. Our approach is like a rock skipping across the surface of this flat lake. Rather than diving deep like a submarine into individual people and periods in time, we are skimming across the surface, just skipping across that top of that lake. Now, there's a disadvantage to that. And it's important to recognize that in a class like this. This is just an introductory level philosophy class, and there's just not enough time to do but so much. And so if we do take this big leap across 2,500 years, is that we're not going to consider any of these historical events and any of these significant figures and technologies and people and philosophy people. We're not able to consider them in very great depth. We're trying to get the highlights that can serve as a foundation if you go and take further philosophy style classes or history classes or whatever in the future. We're just trying to set a basis so you can kind of see the whole picture in its outlines, in just pieces of an outline, not any depth in anything particular. But the hope is that you will be interested in at least some of these people that we encounter and go and learn more about them. And so the biggest disadvantage is the lack of depth. We are just not able to like read and fully understand, say, for example, David Hume. But we can gain a sense of one significant problem that he raised for science and law and everything else that absolutely makes a big difference all the way up to today. And it's still in play, and it's an unresolved problem. So that's the sort of, what we dip down under the water just a little, and then we skip off to something else. But what is the advantages of this approach? Well, one of them is that you get this sense of the history of Western philosophy and Western culture as a whole, which is very useful. You may not have picked that up in various middle school, high school, or other college history classes. You may not have done that, especially not as how history relates to philosophy and philosophy to history. That's a picture that's unique to a class like this because we're looking at philosophy people. We're not doing history, we're doing philosophy. But you get a sense of things from the point of view of the discipline of Western philosophy. That's one of the advantages. And the second advantage is that we gain a sense of how we are where we are today. Like, for example, some people talk about this crisis of the modern world or a crisis of the postmodern world. If anybody has a sense in today's time that things are not as stable as they were even 10 years ago or 20 years ago, that things have changed, that things are not as they were, whether in a positive sense or a not so positive sense, to gain a sense of how we ended up where we are, how we happen to be where we are today with the various concerns and problems and successes and failures of today. That's an advantage of doing this long stretch, this skip across the surface of history approach, is that we can actually consider today by the end of the semester, or we at least get closer to today, at best. Now, what is philosophy? We've seen the historical extent. We've got a feel for it. I've said quite more than I wanted to about it, but I think it's important. And hopefully you will see, everyone in this class will have more of an appreciation for why history and having some historical knowledge is extremely valuable. Hopefully by the end of the semester, you will think that too. If not, hey, I'm doing my best. I'm trying. But to get to what is philosophy, well, what we want is a working definition. And what is a working definition? It's just simply a definition that's not too vague, it's not too kind, and it's not too mean. It captures what it is that a field or whatever it is you're trying to define is in a useful way. That's all a working definition is. And a working definition means that it's ing. It's workable or working, meaning that it may modify. It may not be perfect. It's not meant to be perfect. It's just meant to be usable so that we can go forward in this class throughout the semester. So one of the starting points that's traditional with philosophy is you end up with the Greek word, like philosophia. There's the Greek for it, for those who, and some of the letters in ancient Greek are a little different than they are in modern Greek, but anybody that's familiar with Greek at all will recognize some of those letters. As well if someone's familiar with Cyrillic. There's some letters there that are Cyrillic. But it can be translated, Philosophia could be translated as a love of wisdom, and philosophers are lovers of wisdom. The That's fine as a starting point, but it's based off the meaning of the word, but unfortunately, it's just a little vague. Like there are other disciplines besides philosophy. There are some historians that one could say love wisdom. There are some engineers that could be said to love wisdom. There are some medical people, some nurses, on and on and on, literature people and psychology people and sociology people that love wisdom, want to learn more. They're continuously interested in things and they're investigating. And so saying that philosophy is the love of wisdom and that philosophers are lovers of wisdom, that's true. It is true, for many philosophy people. But it doesn't really pick philosophy out of what makes it distinctive from all these other fields and disciplines and domains of learning and culture and society that a person might encounter. So we need to do better than just the love of wisdom. That philosophy people are certainly not opposed to being wise. We will encounter discussions of wisdom early on. Now, but it's just too vague for our purposes. The next thing is you could be too kind to philosophy. Like you could try to define philosophy as like this special thing that's over and above all other academic disciplines. That philosophy people are in some way smarter or know more than other disciplines. That's not necessarily true either. That would be giving philosophy too much credit. It is true, though, that most academic domains of today originally came out of philosophy. Not all of them. Some of those, like mathematics, was around. It's arguable could have been around before Western philosophy. I mean, Western philosophy people like Plato put a high value in mathematics, but that was because mathematics was already around when he was writing. So, so it wouldn't be right to say that every academic discipline and the sciences, all of that, every bit of it came from philosophy. That's not accurate. And it would be too kind to say that every discipline owes its very existence to philosophy coming first. There's some truth to that, but there's some untruth to that. That there was things like I say, like mathematics, that existed outside, arguably outside of philosophy, and philosophy pulled it in. But things like psychology absolutely came out of philosophy of mind. Absolutely. The journals of psychology, they absolutely did. Social sciences, the study of how groups of people behave and think and act, absolutely came out of philosophy. The natural sciences came out of what was at one time called natural philosophy. It's hard to distinguish someone. I mean, you can distinguish like Robert Boyle and Newton, saying they were doing more sciencey stuff. But science came from what philosophy people were thinking about and doing. So, but it would be too kind to say that philosophy people, therefore, rule over all the other things. That's just not accurate. And then that would be pretentious and arrogant, as is noted here. Philosophy, like all the other disciplines, is still a work in progress. Philosophy people are not, it's not a fixed thing. And then there's also, you could be too mean. Like I do remember this. I was reading in a book. I don't know. It was a fantasy book or science fiction or something. And a person asked a guy like, well, what is philosophy? And the answer was, oh, it's saying as much as possible about absolutely nothing. Well, that's not true. I mean, that philosophy is talking about things that matter and asking questions that do matter. Where this notion that philosophy is just abstract, talking about a lot of nothing, where it comes from is that philosophy does raise and seek answers to questions that at times people would say there are no answers to. Well, that's not accurate. There's always answers to any question. The thing is we don't know what the right or the ultimate answers to those questions are. We have lots of options to choose from, but we have not yet figured out what all the right answers are. That's just part of being human. That we can ask questions that we currently do not have the mental or technological or scientific or social means to answer definitively. But we can suggest answers to any question that's asked. Like someone can say, like, what is the meaning of life? Well, there's plenty of answers to that. Someone would say the meaning of life is to experience love to its fullest extent. Or someone could say, what is the meaning of life? And they say, oh, the meaning of life is just to survive it to the end. That's another answer. Or someone could say the meaning of life is to align oneself with the will of the divine, whatever that's conceptualized at in whatever spiritual religious sense. So we have answers to even a big question like what is the meaning of life? We have lots of answers. And philosophy, what it does is it collects all those answers together and then looks for the support that can be offered for those various answers. But philosophy is not afraid of addressing those questions and trying to find the answers and trying to find the reasons and evidence in support of them. But by doing that, sometimes people get the impression that philosophy is just dealing with a bunch of things that nobody knows anything about. The reality is we often know a lot about things. We just don't have the end result. We don't have the rest of the story yet. But how do you build that? How do you get to an end result of ultimate answer? Is where you have to consider what your options are. And that's a lot of what philosophy is doing. Like another example would be like, what is the most fundamental nature of reality? We have lots of options to that. The pre-Socratics gave answers. The contemporary physicists give answers. Contemporary theoretical physicists give answers. The thing is, though, is we don't yet know who's got the right of it. And so philosophy deals with these big questions across so many different domains. And we'll see that as we go through this video, in this handout. But in summary, the claim that philosophy is talking about nothing or merely engaged in a pointless intellectual exercise with unanswerable questions is just too mean and it's not accurate to what philosophy is doing. So if you go with philosophy's the love of wisdom, it's a bit too vague. It doesn't sort philosophy out from other fields. If you go that philosophy's the origin point of all other knowledge and intellectual and academic activities, and it sort of has some special or privileged access to knowledge that the other domains don't have, you're being too kind. If you say that philosophy is useless and it talks about a bunch of nonsense, you're being too mean and it's not accurate. The thing is there's a little bit of truth to all of those things, that philosophy does focus on questions like why is there something rather than nothing, or what is nothingness. I mean, those kind of questions do occur sometimes in philosophy, and a person can look at like what is nothingness question and say, really? What's the point of worrying about that? I understand. I had some of the same thoughts and have had working in this field for over 25 years at this point. But just know that there are many questions that are asked. It doesn't matter how abstract or weird or strange or pointless they seem. There's a lot of possible answers that we know about already. That if a person just thinks about it, yeah, there's lots of answers to pretty much any question that humans can answer. We just don't know which are right. We have lots of options. And so the point going forward is that you have lots of answer options. Well, which of those is defensible? What are more or less evidenced by the world, by what we know, what we've learned through history, etc. So we need a working definition. So what is that? For this course, the working definition we use is philosophy is systematic and unapologetic inquiry into questions and answers that arise during discussions of this 1 through 7, which we talk about, by means of wonder and argumentative prose. So in order to understand that definition, it breaks down into 3 pieces. And those are described in great detail here because it's important, but I'm just going to give you the highlights. Is that philosophy is systematic and unapologetic inquiry. What does that mean? It means, first of all, systematic. There is a method to the madness. When you go into philosophy, immediately it can seem like some strange butterfly hedgehog, stuck on the side of an armadillo that with a starfish. I mean, just imagine this really weird, strange creature that you're like, what is going on here? If you have that feeling, you're not alone. I had the same feeling when I first went into this field. There's so much going on that it's hard to gain some sense. You wonder, is there some system to this? Is there some pattern? Well, there is indeed. That philosophy is systematic, and we'll see that through argumentation. But one way to think about it, just the cleanest way, the simplest way, is that the pattern in philosophy is that questions are asked by philosophy people, science people, math people, history people, whoever, everyday people. It doesn't matter. Questions are asked. Then answers are provided to those. Philosophy people collect those answers. That they propose answers themselves. They raise questions themselves. But they also look at the questions that are raised and answers provided by all other domains. So questions are asked, answers are proposed, provided, collected. Then the next step is you wonder, well, why that answer? Of any 1,000 answers that are provided, why think that any are actually true or accurate? At that point, you're asking for reasons. You're asking for evidence, things that support an answer's potential truth or accuracy. And so you have questions, you have answers, you have reasons offered in support of the answers. And then the final stage of this is once you put an answer or a central claim with reasons, you have what's known as an argument in the academic and technical sense, not the shouting, yelling match sense. And then what philosophy do is they look at these arguments and they critique them or they analyze them to see, well, are the reasons any good? That I can give an answer like the meaning of life is to find love and experience it to its fullest extent. And then, well, why think that's true? Oh, well, love is this fundamental aspect of being a human being, and that in order for a life form to truly live, it needs to experience love. I mean, there's some circularity in these reasons, but regardless, you see that I'm trying to give you sentences that would support this answer that what is the meaning of life is to experience love to the fullest extent. Why? Because we're talking about human life and human love, and it's not really human if you do not experience love. I mean, that's arguable, but still, that's the point of analysis, is to figure out which of these reasons is being offered for an answer to a question, which of them are actually true, plausible. And so once you get questions, you get answers, you get reasons, you've got argumentation at that point, and then philosophy people analyze arguments, they raise objections, they look for examples of support and counterexamples of opposition, and they assess all that stuff. They collect it all together, they present it and try to articulate it in the clearest possible way, and then they hand it out and they share it. It's published in journals, it's published in books, and anybody that knows where to look can access it and hopefully gain something from it. And then that's added to the pile of human knowledge that hopefully turns into wisdom one day. So there is a pattern. It always starts with questions, then it goes through answers, then it goes through reasons, through argumentation, and then it ends up with and then it moves to objections and replies, and then it ends up in sharing with the world. That's the pattern of inquiry. It's the pattern of philosophy. So it's systematic. There is a 1, 2, 3, 4 pattern to it. It's not just a free-for-all. Unapologetic. It's unapologetic in the sense that philosophy knows no bounds. That everybody's academic, technical, cultural, social, political, legal, religious, spiritual backyard, that's all philosophy's backyard too. That philosophy does not stop at the borders of biology. No, philosophy people will jump right over in and say, what are the biologists talking about? What questions are they concerned with? Have they satisfactorily defended their answers to those questions? What are the alternative answers provided? We're looking at biology, but what about a historian? What about a mathematician? What about just philosophy people? And then we're going across all the borders of other academic disciplines and not asking permission for doing so. That's why it's unapologetic that you have people that specialize in philosophy of biology, but you also have philosophy people that will look in biology, sociology, psychology, neuroscience. They'll be going in all these domains and learning about them and trying to extract the questions, the concerns, and the answers and reasoning provided by all these people, and trying to see how successful has that been from an argumentation, from an evidentiary standpoint. So philosophy knows no bounds. And it goes in and looks at other disciplines, whether they want us to or not. But that's perceived by most philosophy people in the Western world as being helpful, and by many people in these disciplines as well. I mean, we don't make a lot of enemies, but sometimes it happens. Some people don't like philosophy people rooting around in what they consider to be their domain. And, you can't blame them sometimes. But philosophy people are trying to be helpful, ultimately. Now, the next part, so it's systematic, there's a pattern, there's a method to the madness, it's unapologetic, meaning it goes all over and deals with questions and answers and argumentation in any field philosophy people find an interest in. And then into questions and answers that arrive during discussions of what? Well, let's move forward. Into any questions or reasons or objections, replies that fall into any of these 7 domains. These are the branches of philosophy. This relates to the discussion for this week. What are the branches or sub-parts of these do you find most interesting? That you have metaphysics, ontology, cosmology, you have epistemology, axiology. I know these are probably new words. It's the jargon of philosophy. You'll become very familiar with them by the end of the semester. So don't be put off by them right now. There's logic, computation, there's history of philosophy, there's special topics, there's metaphilosophy. So what are these things briefly? Well, metaphysics, ontological, cosmological discussions, they all involve some question of what is the nature of X. And X can be these things that compose our reality, that we think do. For example, what is the nature of being or existence? That's a metaphysical, ontological question. What is the nature of free will? What's the nature of properties? What about parts and borders and objects? Things like that. Some of those questions you'd think physics is dealing with, and it is. Indeed, some theoretical physics, when they talk about superstrings, they're over in the metaphysical, ontological, cosmological domain all day long. They may not say that's what they're doing, but that's what they are doing in a lot of theoretical physics. But it also, what is the nature of good and evil and value and truth, falsity, God, all that stuff, that shows up in metaphysical, ontological, cosmological branch of philosophy. A lot of interesting things, and this is just the beginning. That etc. could keep going for pages and pages and pages. And there's philosophy people that focus on and specialize and work with each. Some people just focus on emotion. Some people focus on, say, free will and determinism. Some people focus on this growth stuff. Some focus on this notion of progress that politicians talk about sometimes. Or science people do. And some people just focus on philosophy of mind. Indeed, that's one of my specializations, is philosophy of mind and experience, as well as other domains. I have training in electrical and software engineering, both in philosophy of mind, trying to build intelligent robots. That was part of my work in graduate school. So then I've worked very heavily in this domain of the metaphysical, ontological, and cosmological. This is one of the domains that I work a lot in. But that's one domain in philosophy. It's fascinating. Then there's epistemological. And it makes sense if you think about it. You say, this is your question. What is the nature of mind? Like, okay, well, people can give hundreds of answers to that, give a bunch of reasons, build theories, all that stuff. Well, once you have all those things, you say, okay, I got all these answers, all these arguments, reasons, theories. Well, how do you know any of that's true? That's what epistemology focuses on. It's the branch of philosophy that's like, well, what is knowledge? What does it mean to know? And in order to actually answer that question, it's interesting. A lot of times in life we say, well, I know these things. Well, what does it mean for you to know those things? What is knowledge? In order to answer that question, you have to investigate things like, well, how is knowledge different from a mere opinion? How is it different from a belief? What role does justification play in knowledge? Like, you have to have reasons for what you think you know. And then there's truth, falsity, once again. And there's certainty versus doubt versus fallibility. We make mistakes. So could we be mistaken about everything we think we know? That's a question shows up in epistemology. Fascinating questions. I work in that domain as well. The next is axiology, study of value. What is valuable? What ought we to value? Within this domain, you get questions of aesthetics, like that's your beauty, your arts, music, and philosophy of aesthetics. That falls in this because aesthetics is like appreciation. Like, people would think that certain works of arts have value more than just the money value, what people are willing to pay. It's like sometimes you can see a building that human beings built, and like all one has to do is look at, like, say, the Palace of Versailles or Versailles, however you say it. I'm not French, so I messed the word up. But the place that Louis XIV lived in and made his base of operations, that group of buildings and structures and gardens and farms, that place, if a person looks at it, you can look it up. Look up Louis XIV, French king, and Versailles, and you'll see, and you can see tours of that. And when you see that building, it's hard not to say that it lacks all beauty. There's something there that seems valuable. It seems like it would be a loss to human civilizations for it not to exist. The same for what's in lots of other nations and countries too. But that's aesthetics. It's focused on what makes something beautiful. What makes, why is this creation, this artifact, or just natural mountain? Why is it valuable to us? Why does it matter to us? That's aesthetics. Then there's morality and ethics, and I broke this down into subcategories just so you can see that these subfields do have content to them. I won't go through all of them, but morality and ethics is basically the study of goods and bads, rights and wrongs. What ought we to do in given circumstances? Do we have certain moral obligations to do things or avoid doing others? It's essentially, a lot of this is, what should we do? What ought we do in life? That's the type of questions that drive morality and ethics. And there's lots of answers to that. And hopefully you can look through this descriptive, normative, virtue versions of ethics, and you'll see there's an enormous amount of questions that can be and sub-questions and ways of approaching this stuff. Like, under this is the notion of, well, what does it mean to live well? That's in virtue ethics. Like, what is the meaning of life? What does it mean to have lived a well-lived life? That's all in virtue ethics. Applied ethics. This is your more like, what makes for a good business? What makes for a good government? What makes for a bad business? What is good customer service versus bad customer service? What is it that serves to distinguish the two? That's an applied ethics. Meta ethics. This is interesting. This is once all the other domains of ethics have done their work, you come along and you say, okay, well, what is the meaning of good precisely? What is bad or evil? You know, are other ethics people just talking about things that are fictions? Might there be no goods and no bads? Or might goods and bads just reduce down to a person saying, yuck, I don't like that, or yay, hooray, I like that? That's a position that came up in metaethics in 1920s, 30s. It was called emotivism. There's all of that. It shows up in metaethics. Meta just means after or beyond. Like, this is what happens after you've got thousands of years of ethics going on. People take a step back and say, well, what's the point of it all? What are we trying to achieve with ethics? And then there's lots of possible answers and argumentation that can go along with that. The next branch of philosophy, totally fascinating. I work within this one. I mean, by the way, I teach ethics classes, not because I specialized in ethics, but it's just what many philosophy people are trained to be able to do ethics classes because they're popular. They, students like them. They're helpful for many other fields. That ethics and philosophy tends to be one of the services philosophy people can provide to whatever country they happen to be in. Logic computation, fascinating. This is where the structure of our reasoning and arguments. Are there any rules that, like, if we say things in a certain way, does that end up capturing more of the truth? Or do certain ways of thinking about things always lead us into error and falsity? Moreover, computation. How does the mind actually work? Is it like software and the brain is hardware? And if so, well, software runs on rules and artificial languages like Python or the C language, C++, Ruby, etc. Is there something like that running in our brains, in our minds? If so, well, can we find those rules? If we could, we'd better understand the human mind. Maybe we could actually explain things better about in science or whatever if we understood it. And it deals with like fallacy, clarity, consistency, coherence. All of these concepts are within logic and computation. I do some work in that as well. I've taught classes on deductive, inductive logic. History of philosophy. This is another whole branch of philosophy. It's different, and we're going to encounter this throughout the semester. Of history of philosophy is focused centrally on particular philosophical questions or individual philosophy people that have showed up in history. And you focus on some of the context around the person, but it all goes back to the philosophy person. And we'll be doing some of that this semester, seeing some of it. Special topics. This is the grab all that whatever isn't accounted for in metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, logic, computation, the special topics, it rakes in most everything else. This is where you get your philosophy of X, and X could be any of the other disciplines, from biology, philosophy of medicine, philosophy of nursing, philosophy of sociology, anthropology, economics, political science. There's a domain in philosophy that's dedicated to just focusing on the questions and concerns and arguments and evidence that show up in every academic discipline, every technical, like there's philosophy of engineering, and on and on and on. And if you see that all those other academic and technical fields have subfields, like there's biology, marine biology, ecology, well, you have philosophy of ecology. You'll have philosophy of marine biology. You'll have philosophy of the environment. You'll have just, it's bottomless. Philosophy is huge. Also, and then this one's interesting, we'll encounter some of this as we get later in this document. And in fact, in this class is metaphilosophy. Metaphilosophy is beyond or after philosophy. So we have philosophy running for 2,500 years, like we did metaethics. You have ethics that's been operating for 2,500 years, and people say, okay, what's the point of it? Why are we doing ethics? Are we making any advancements? Or are we just chasing our own tail to no end? This is quality control. Any of these meta fields like metaphilosophy ask those types of questions about philosophy. In fact, the very questions we're looking at right now, what is philosophy? What do philosophy people do? What is the point of it all? Those are metaphilosophical questions. We're doing metaphilosophy in this handout in this video. And then so the next thing is through these 1 through 7, what becomes pretty clear, hopefully once you read through them and see just how much there is in this field, that philosophical inquiry has no bounds. Like I said, that's the unapologetic quality, but it's also just the reality of it. Is philosophy is not confined to any particular academic or technical or cultural, social, political domain. Philosophy people can pick up any domain, learn about it. Sometimes they have to spend years doing so. Like I had to spend quite like 10 years with electrical engineering and software to be able to work and successfully function within philosophy in mind. And it's like philosophy tends to require that you learn more about entirely different fields than philosophy. But there's no bounds. I mean, you can pick. When you go in, the world is open to you in terms of what you want to analyze and look at argumentation for. And you can change in life. You can always switch to something else. You can do philosophy of mind for 20 years and then all of a sudden decide you want to do ethics or epistemology or whatever. And you're not confined. You do not have to keep doing the same thing or focusing on the same types of questions forever in philosophy. By means of wonder and argumentative prose. Yeah, this is the mechanism that gets us started. So how does all philosophy start? Well, it starts with questions. Well, what are those questions? What makes them happen? Well, wonder. Sheer curiosity. It's like you see something, you hear something, and you wonder, well, what is that? Why is that? That's the start of all philosophy. And you have some quotes there from Plato and Aristotle that it's like, for better or worse, philosophy begins with someone being curious and asking what questions, why questions, how, where. What does it mean? That is where philosophy begins. It's where all inquiry begins. So it's not unique to philosophy, but it's definitely some of the questions you encounter in philosophy. It comes from inherently curious people. And so philosophy people pick a question, then they start looking for answers for it. Yeah, it's like, it's not possible, though. See, the thing is you could wonder and ask questions endlessly. But you got to have something that reels you back into the world. And so you can make advancements in philosophy or add to our knowledge. Is you can't do philosophy effectively without some core mode of operation. Well, what that is navigating and utilizing argumentative prose, argumentation. So I'm not going to read through all this. Like I've said, you will want to look at this, but I define what is an argument. What does it mean for us? The simple thing is there's a diagram here. Is that you have a question, an answer is provided. That's your thesis or conclusion. And then reasons are offered in support of it. Someone says, what is the purpose of life? It's to love to the fullest extent. That's your conclusion. Love to the fullest extent is the meaning of life. Then you try to gather up reasons in support of that claim. I'm not saying it's a good claim. I'm not saying it's accurate, but it is a claim. It's a thesis. It's a conclusion. It's something that requires you tell somebody more before they're going to buy it or think maybe it's true. And that's what reasons are. They're just sentences in support of one core focused sentence. That's all arguments are. There's examples, there's better examples. That may not be the best example of an argument, but it gives you a sense of how analysis happens in this. And there's more details. It gives you breakdowns of argumentation. You'll certainly want to look at this. We'll be doing some of this throughout the entire semester, especially in the context of discussions. Now, yeah, and there's some disabusing that what makes claims different from opinions. This is very important for philosophy. You'll want to look at that. And then on we go to inquiry. That's discussed in this handout. And so philosophers, we create argumentation. It's our analog to the scientific method. And that's what you can think of it, that the scientific method has steps, and there's different ways, and you do certain steps in certain orders, or you can, some steps have to come after others, but it's like you can go, like, say you make some observations, then you discover a problem, then you propose an answer, a hypothesis to explain or account for what you're seeing, to make a prediction about it. Then you go and collect more data, and then you test it, you model it mathematically, maybe with computers, maybe you grow fungus in a petri dish, and then you record those results and you compare those to what you hypothesized or predicted to happen. Did your prediction, did it have merit, or were you way off the mark of what you actually found? And then you try to draw some conclusions from it and raise and explain, this is how I did things, so another scientist can do those things. And then it's like, okay, well, here's where it maybe could be improved. Here's some ideas about further research. Standard scientific method. Well, in philosophy, we have the same thing. Questions are asked, answers are provided, argumentation is offered in support of those answers. That's what this whole section about argumentation's trying to help everyone see. And then we have objections, reply to them, and eventually we share too what we've done, just like the sciences, historians, etc. Detached perspective. This is important in philosophy. That it's important not to think that everything you encounter in philosophy, just because, say, David Hume argues for a particular claim, he makes a claim and gives you sentences in support of it and examples. We don't really know what David Hume as an individual truly believes. We don't know what any other human being truly believes in, that we can't read their minds. So what philosophy does is takes a detached perspective. We just look at what's said. We don't worry about, does this person really believe it? Are they lying to us? Those kind of things. It's just they made a sentence, a claim that's an answer to a question. They've given me other sentences and evidence in support of that claim. So they gave me an argument. All right, is that argument valid? Is it invalid? Are the reasons actually true? Meaning, is it sound? Things like that. And so we just take it at face value, but we don't think more or less of the individual that offers the argument. We just analyze the arguments. So the idea is we don't get emotionally involved in what an argument is saying. We're just analyzing it in a detached way. Just like a scientist normally doesn't get involved in and get concerned about, does the fungi in the petri dishes, what is it, might it not like the fact that I'm getting it to reproduce in these little confined petri dishes, or bacteria, or whatever it is. It's like, the biologist or scientist isn't really worried about that. They're not worried about what's going on in the mind of the fungi or the mind of the little mouse in the laboratory. They're focused on what's happening in the mouse's body. Well, that's what we're up to in philosophy when it comes to people and the claims and reasons they give. We're not really focused on what is this person really thinking. We're more focused on what did they say in terms of argumentation. Like, what are the words on the page rather than what's going on in that person's mind when they wrote those words. Sometimes that's helpful. It's necessary to understand the words on the page, but we're not holding people that they have to have been revealing their deepest, darkest secrets to us. We don't do that. So yeah, we've reached the end of our working definition, and there's a summary of it. The next, what do philosophers do in general and on a daily basis? Well, they inquire, they create arguments, they read other arguments that people have created, they ask more questions, they go find more questions, they collect more answers. I mean, it's a lot of research and talking to other people and learning about what's going on in whatever domain that you're operating in. That if you're working in philosophy of computation, well, you better be learning about computers and computation and algorithms and software and all of that. And so philosophy people are educating themselves on what they need to know in order to really understand the goals, the questions, the argumentation of whatever domain they're in. And then they're presenting their findings and arguing for what they think they found. Now, what, if anything, is the goal of philosophy? Well, it's captured fairly well as far as Western philosophy goes. Not everybody would agree with this inside Western philosophy. Some, as we will see, outright would deny it. But historically, and even in the present, most would agree that this thing from Galen way back in the Roman times is still accurate to this day. This is attributed to Galen by Robert Boyle. Whether Galen actually said this or not, we don't know, but it's a useful quote for us to use in the context of this handout. It's like, one must be daring and approach the truth. For even if we may not grasp it completely, yet we will get closer to it than we are now. That is basically the goal of philosophy, Western philosophy, is to figure out what is true and what's not. For better or worse, that's what it is. But it's truth on a large scale. It's not just truth in a scientific sense, not just in a spiritual sense. As you'll see if you look through those 1 through 7 branches of philosophy, philosophy is looking for truth. And so, I mean, what is that? We're trying to learn more about it and find smaller or larger portions of it. Well, what is truth? In the end, truth with a capital T, big T truth, meaning, someone says, well, what is the truth? For philosophy people, most of the time, it's pretty simple. Truth is that which resists us. It is this phenomena of reality that we live in. There are certain things that we can get away with, some things we can't, some things that are just what sometimes are called facts, although facts can be a tough word sometimes. It gets blurred, especially in politics and various things. Then when people are talking about facts, sometimes they're just talking about what they, whatever their narrative of what's going on. That's not what philosophy is looking for. Philosophy is looking for this kind of phenomena. So here's an example. Say that you really want to win the lottery, and a person can even convince themselves that the next ticket they win will be the winner. They can want that to be the case. They can believe that's the case. And yet, that seems to have absolutely little to no impact on whether the next lottery ticket they buy or scratch off is a winner. That our beliefs have almost no impact and our wants on what the fact of is that ticket a winner or not happens to be. It's like we can't will the ticket to be a winner, no matter how much we may try and want it to be. It's like there's resistance there, that we don't have the ability just to will winning lottery tickets into existence. I mean, in terms of not forging them and things like that, but just like playing the lottery as the lotteries normally function in various states. The world or reality seems to resist us from being able to do that. In some science fiction and fantasy, some magic systems work that way. You can just will this to be there, wave your wand, and it happens. But the reality we live in doesn't seem to work that way. That seems to be a part of the truth. Also, a person could really want to breathe salt water. A standard human being, they could want to swim with sharks and other sea creatures and be able to breathe salt water. Not be confined to this terrestrial plane. We want to go and be like Aquaman and be able to go under the ocean and breathe. and communicate with all the starfish and sea urchins. The reality is, though, is we can believe we're able to do that. And then when we wade out in the ocean and we eventually open our mouths and the salt water comes rushing in, it's not going to work out well. We all know that. It's like it could happen. I'm not saying it's impossible. There could be some mutation in a human genome, and eventually we get gills and are able to breathe salt water or live in it and be able to extract the oxygen or whatever we need from it through some gills on the side of our necks. But that's not the norm right now for us. And so the salt water, the reality itself is going to hit us back if we believe it and it's not the case. The reality has a way of hitting us back and saying, nope, we'll die. If we try to breathe it and don't get out of it, we'll just drown. And so there's something there that's resisting our will and our beliefs and our desires. That's what an idea of truth is. There's also this fact that we can want very much for a particular view of the world to be true. Some say a science view, and it not be the case. We have scientific theories that have held for 200-300 years, and then all of a sudden, some other scientist or whoever comes along, and they make one discovery that upends all that. That's happened many times throughout the history of science. That's not just a one-off. We've had fundamental misunderstandings of things that just went on, and then we catch them. So that makes, so it's like just because we really want our theories or assume they're true doesn't mean they actually are. It's like reality does not have to line up with what we want or believe or desire. And so the notion of truth with a capital T is just this situation where it's something beyond what we control. That's the idea of truth philosophy people are often operating with. That's the notion of it objects. But if we can also craft our efforts more in line with whatever the truth seems to be. Like if we use scuba tanks, indeed we can go under the water and look at starfish as they're, waddling along the bottom for a certain period of time until the tanks go dry or run out. We have built tremendous technology. Humans have, from x-rays to engines to planes to tractors to spaceships. If you work with what reality seems to be allowing for, whatever truth is, you're able to do these things. But if you try to go beyond the bounds, it's like in engineering, you'll often hear this notion of you don't have gain over unity. Like if you put X amount of a certain thing in energy, you're not going to get more energy out of a system than you put into it. That, if you put 100 whatever in, and you're not going to get 105 out. These sort of free energy devices. That's why electrical engineers, they'll look at that, the ones that have worked in a long time and be like, well, that's not going to work. They don't even have to try to build it because it could just be an assumption that it's not possible to get more out than you put into something in terms of energy. But it seems to be part of a truth of the world, one of those physical limits or maybe spiritual limits. We don't know. But that's the sort of idea. You can look through these examples and get a feel for it. And so kind of what you can think about, all those questions that occur in the 1 through 7, those branches of philosophy, what are all of them after is, well, what is the truth in regards to whatever metaphysical thing we're interested in the metaphysics of something? What is it in regards to knowledge? What is it in regards to ethics? That's kind of, so what is the truth in specific cases and in the overall? And you read through this and you'll get a sense for how that works. Now, while we're searching for truth in all its forms and aspects, there are ways of seeing the world or worldviews or biases that can help us and that can hinder us. There are many of them. We'll just look at a few. You can read through these. This is just a way that I labeled them and summarized some of them. This is by no means an exhaustive list, There's more than these, and there's different ways that people have described these, but these are certain ways that a person could have belief systems, how they see things that happen around them, and how they interpret their experiences, the reasons. It's kind of like this is what we perceive goes into our minds, and then we already have in our minds assumptions about what we see and what is right and wrong, good and bad, what's true or false, and that falls into domains like this a lot of times, like spiritual, empirical. You can have spiritual, empirical hybrids. You can have relative, subjective, skeptic, agnostic, ideological, real politics, cynic. You can have nihilist, postmodernist. You can have some or all hybrids. You can have people that manifest all these and more. But what we have to be careful about with these things is each of these views tend to make assumptions about what truth is. And if you're on a quest for truth, like a lot of Western philosophy's been for 2,500 years, then you have to know that there are certain ways that people, even philosophy people, will see the world that could limit. You could be missing out on things. You could be thinking that truth lies over in whatever science is doing, but if there's a whole lot of it lurking over in the spiritual, you're missing out on maybe what's most true about existence. So philosophy people need to be familiar with all of these things so that they can catch themselves from becoming too bogged down in any one of them. We don't always succeed, but we try. I mean, the spiritual, it wagers that the most important aspects of truth are to be found in the spiritual rather than the empirical realm. The spiritual way of seeing the world is associated with all the world religions, all the sorts of spirituality you can imagine, all the way from Islam to the ancient Greek and Roman mythos, the Norse religions, all of it. Every one of the people that have believed such things and still do, they have a more spiritual worldview. And that worldview can be extremely helpful when you're looking for truth. Or if truth is in other domains and you limit yourself just to the spiritual domain, you may miss out on things. So these worldviews are just a way of thinking that if you focus wholly on one, you may be neglecting others. And in terms of philosophy does not have the luxury of ignoring any of these. And, that's the takeaway message, of all this with these worldviews. I mean, and you can read through this. I'm not going to read through all these worldviews, but you definitely want to. And you see, I'm not saying this is a perfect description of every one of these ways of seeing the world, but it gives you a start and a feel for what, it's like. You may be able to say, yeah, I mean, I kind of reside within one of these, or maybe a few of these. Or at certain points in life, I resided in many of these and left some behind and picked others up. The key to note about it, though, if you're doing philosophy and you're on a search for the truth, is kind of like you have to be willing to look in all these. That what science is doing may be shedding light on what the truth is. What the Catholic priest is up to may be shedding light on what's going on in the truth. What a witch is doing may be shedding light on parts of truth. We don't know until we look. And we have to give everybody a charitable chance in philosophy. But some of these worldviews are outright opposed to one another. Like you can get some in hardcore science that would say that the spiritual realm and ghosts and souls and gods and angels and demons, they'd say that's just artifacts of the past. That's not real. Well, at that point, one has closed their mind. And what if there is truth over in angels and demons and various things? The reality is as humans, we don't have the ultimate answers to all those kind of questions yet. And if a person picks up, say, the empirical worldview and just runs with it, fine. But they won't be able to do philosophy in as honest and as potentially productive a way if they just close off some of these domains. That's kind of the idea of these worldviews. That's how they can be a bias in the bad sense, that it bends your line away in your quest from truth. Truth may be in front of you, and you bend, your line deviates, it diverges, it tangents away from what was right in front of you for whatever reason. Became too locked into any one of these worldviews. And then there's spiritual empirical hybrids. We'll encounter some of that with Newton and Boyle. The relative subjective, we'll encounter this semester. We'll encounter examples and argumentation from all of these worldviews throughout the semester. And this view starts the idea that this notion of capital T truth, this truth that objects, that resists, or that we can work in accordance with, that I've talked about, that Western philosophy tends to be searching for, this relative subjectivist worldview denies that such even exists. So they would say that our quest for truth in Western philosophy is not so productive. Well, it's possible. In philosophy, you have to entertain the possibilities. You don't have to agree with every possibility, but you at least have to entertain it. Give it a charitable read. Think about it. The skeptic, the agnostic, skeptics tend to, going to question, well, how do you know? No one really knows that. Why do you think you do? Or a skeptic can just be, I suspend belief. I'm not going to agree or disagree with you, at this point in time. And the agnostic's going to be more like, well, I just don't know. And those are valid worldviews. They exist. The ideological, we're kind of familiar with this in current times, whether we know it or not, that a lot of this is happening right now in real time in the Western world, where certain groups, they have certain beliefs and idea systems, and that typically the hallmark of ideologic stuff is that whatever ideas or alternatives that exist outside of this set of ideas and beliefs and values and goals of a group, whatever exists outside of that as alternatives, well, those inside the group would say those alternatives are not viable, they're false, they're not true. They're in some cases, that's the opposition. So whatever the opposition says, we just say no to in principle. That's the kind of the ideologic mindset. And it's real. It happens. There's lots of examples of it. Some of these are better and worse examples of it, but you can read through it and see it. Ideologic stuff can be problematic for philosophy, especially if a philosophy person happens to go into any of it and adopt it, because inherently ideologic worldviews tend to very sharply and quickly cut off what's outside the ideology, the set of beliefs and ideas and ideals of the group. They cut off all the other stuff outside that, and all that other stuff may have some of the truth in it as well. And so a philosophy person would immediately be messing up the quest for truth. Even if you think you found it in a group, maybe you didn't. That's the way the philosophy person has to look at these things. Realpolitik, the cynic, that's very interesting. We'll encounter one, Machiavelli, and others throughout the semester. And it's interesting. This is a person that focuses on the way things are, not how we may wish or want them to be. Now, they could be wrong about what they think the way things are is, but normally the realpolitik person is accurate in terms of how humans do things in real life. Like, how does a law actually get passed through Congress to be signed by a president? How does that actually work? It's not the PBS or the standard story we heard as kids. There's a lot more involved. And the realpolitik person will inform you about that. And so they look for their sort of truth is whatever is actionable, whatever you can do something about. We're militarily weak at this point. We need to be stronger. We're militarily strong at this point, so we can do things that we couldn't do if we weren't strong. Things like that. And how do we build up a military? Things like that. Machiavelli cared a whole lot about questions like that. What is the nature of a republic? Really? What is the nature of negotiation? Really? What's really involved in doing treaties? What things will be resisted always? What things will help you get along with somebody so they sign your treaty and actually follow it? That's realpolitik worldview. But don't worry about what would be ideal, what would make the most just world, the most free world, the most bestest of all possible worlds. Realpolitik is not concerned about that at all. Whether there's truth that lies in that domain, fine, but that's not what the realpolitik person's focused on. The postmodernist, this is someone like Nietzsche. You're a nihilist, postmodernist. It's arguable. You could say Nietzsche was not a nihilist because he did have proposals. It wasn't all just nothing. But postmodernist, yeah, he's got some of those traits. But there's others that we'll encounter. But the idea with the nihilist and the postmodernist a lot of times is the nihilist is that, well, there's just nothing. There's no meaning. There's no purpose. So when you ask the question, what is the meaning of life? The nihilist will say nothing. That's the answer. Then they have to try to defend that answer. But that's their answer. What is the meaning of life? Nothing. What is the reason behind it all? Nothing. That's your nihilist. Your postmodernist is, well, the answers we can, here's the old answers. Here's why they don't work. And so we can make our own. We can re-envision the world. We can make our own truth, and things like that. And it describes how that works with the quest for truth. Then there's some all hybrids. You get people that have aspects of all of these worldviews run around in their mind all at the same time. And that's why sometimes life is so confusing. It's so difficult to understand what's going on, oftentimes because we have versions of all of these running around in our minds. And so as a philosophy person, is extremely important to try to sort that out. And, acknowledge and be aware of your own, weaknesses or hindrances as far as finding truth is. And there's a summation of the ways of seeing the world. You can read that. So why not study philosophy? The pros is that, as I've indicated, the backyard of philosophy is the entire scope of the planet and beyond. Whatever questions, wherever they're asked, whatever answers, don't matter if it's in a science, don't matter if it's in math, it doesn't matter if it's in any particular country, that philosophy can analyze and consider questions and answers and reasoning that originates anywhere on any topic. But the topics are those 7. Those branches they encapsulate pretty much human inquiry in total. And so it's as large as the yards of basically everybody else. Every other field, discipline, everyday person that asks questions and propose answers and reasons, philosophy can be there. So that's one pro. It's as large as, human questioning and answering. The primary tools, argumentation, like making claims, giving reasons for those claims, analyzing the results of that, sharing it with others. That's the primary tool. That's our sort of microscope that we use. Our scientific method analog is the way argumentation functions, and it's extremely useful. Like I've written it out there, asking questions, proposing, collecting answers to questions, offering, collecting reasons for the answers, assembling such into whole arguments. That procedure is the philosophy equivalent of scientific method. And that skill set is extremely useful throughout all life. Anytime that someone makes a claim to you, you can always ask for reasons. And if you're good at knowing the types of questions to ask, whether it's at your job, it's in a relationship, it's with your family, it's with certain things that, about an author that you're reading in a book, a book you're reading, you read a textbook in one of your classes, and you wonder, well, what is this person really trying to convince me of? What are the questions this person asking? Are those the most productive to be asking? You can use it in all your classes. It helps with standardized tests. You can kind of reverse engineer what questions are asking you in tests. All kinds of things. to improve your accuracy at answering questions. There's tons of value in learning this sort of pattern that philosophy uses of analysis. It's very valuable in life. That's one of the pros of philosophy. And then also it can be described, like I have at least Western philosophy, as one big quest for truth with a capital T, that which resists or allows us, that which is beyond us, that our beliefs and wills and wants tend to have very little to no control over. It happens. We have to adapt to it, not the other way around. we have to go along with what it's up to rather than what we might want at times. We can't force lottery tickets to be winners by sheer force of will. And so that quest for truth, figuring out what is that phenomena? What is this thing that seems to resist us, but then seems to go along with us and allow us to build skyscrapers and all this other stuff? You know, what's going on with that? Whether it's spiritual, empirical, doesn't matter. We're interested in all of it. And so if that's interesting to you, if you're interested in learning more about that phenomena, well, then philosophy is definitely for you, because that is what it's doing all the time. That like, what is, and so at that point, if truth is that which is resistant or that which objects to us, we push it, it'll push us back. Sometimes we push and it says, come on through. You know, it's almost like personified truth, but it is a phenomenon. It's there. And philosophy people are chase it in lots of ways. Most do. Not all. Some, like I said, some worldviews deny it even exists. But regardless, the majority seem to keep, to not think that in philosophy. And so if that's an interest to you, figuring out more about what truth is, then philosophy, certainly that's a pro for you about it. The next is philosophy can be enormously interesting and fun. It is. I mean, there'll be philosophy questions you'll encounter in this semester, hopefully. If not, if you take other philosophy classes, they just stick in your mind. And you're like, what is the answers to that? And you'll get answers, and then you wonder about reasoning, and then you go to talk about it with a family member or a spouse or a friend at work, and it sticks with you, and it can be so interesting, and it can be such a conversation starter with other people, and it gives us a moment to step out of all that may be going on in our lives, and just gives us a moment to think about something that we may never find a final answer to, but it's inherently interesting. And maybe hopefully there'll be questions like that you encounter this semester. That's what makes it fun and keeps people interested. It helps people wonder. It cultivates curiosity. That's one way you can think about philosophy. Now, the cons. Well, first of all, if a person is not curious and doesn't want to strain their mind on these sort of quests for truth, then, I didn't list that here, but that's something that's definitely, they may not like philosophy. If they're not interested in anything but what it takes to make it day to day, but philosophy can still be helpful, even in that regard. But if they're just not interested in the things we talk about this semester, well, then that's going to be a con. I mean, hopefully that's not the case with people in the class, but if it is, sometimes that happens. Some people don't enjoy philosophy. It's just a fact. Well, also, the first few weeks of philosophy class or reading a philosophy book written, by somebody, it can be extremely painful, because that's the reason this handout's so long, is to try to give people enough to take some of that pain away. You may think, whoa, all these pages, that's painful in itself. But you can just trust me that it would be a lot worse if you didn't have these pages because it's just hard. Philosophy is so big, has so many different questions and so many different argumentations and ways of thinking and about the world, that it can be really painful to get to feel like, okay, I kind of know what's going on in this. It's not like biology. It's not like anthropology. It takes more work to actually get a feel for philosophy. It's not easy to become a biologist. Don't get me wrong, or a historian. But in philosophy, to me, it's always seemed a little more difficult. I could go over into electrical engineering, and it's like, okay, I'm learning about this phenomena of electricity with current, voltage, resistance, impedance, capacitance, all these things. And it's like, okay, what is the point of this? Well, it's to make cool and interesting electronic devices. And then I can write software for some of those things. And then, or I can just understand how the technological world that we are surrounded in, more about how it works. And it's pretty straightforward to make sense of what is going on in electrical engineering. I can use the mathematics to understand things that baffle others. I can use mathematics to keep me from having to fail and build 1,000 prototypes that were never going to work if I just use the math. So that's pretty straightforward what's going on. And a person gets into it and they kind of know what's going on. Whereas philosophy is not like that. I've tried in this video and in this handout to give you a better sense of what it is. But that can be a con for some people. But I encourage you, stay with it, work during the class, and it becomes hopefully it becomes fun and interesting for you. But I will be the first to admit, sometimes it's disorienting. It's not the easiest thing to just jump right in and understand. Next, navigating argumentation. Sometimes people are just not accustomed to the ways arguments work. Hopefully this handout helps, and as we practice through the semester, you become better at it. But it can be tedious. It can be you're like, I just want to make this claim. But you can't get away with that in philosophy. You can't just make a claim or give an answer to a question. You got to give reasons for it. And then somebody's going to come along and assess whether your reasons make any sense. Are they true? Are they accurate? Might they be false? You work really hard to create an example that helps to clarify something you think, and then someone else comes along and shows you, nope, that didn't do it. I mean, that can be frustrating. That can be tedious. But it's just part of the process. It's like doing the scientific method. You do a big experiment, you really predict, and you hope your prediction's accurate. But then you do it, nope, you were wrong. And you may have spent months or years working on it, and it doesn't work out. Truth wasn't on the side of it. You really wanted it to be, but it wasn't. So that happens in philosophy. That can be very frustrating, but no more so, I think, than in philosophy or in engineering and electrical engineering. I have built tons of things that the math would say it's possible, but then when I do it with the parts and components available, it didn't work out. I've written lots of software that did not work out. I can make it do something, but not what I initially envisioned it to do. So, maybe there's not much different in philosophy in that, but most any field, whether it's nursing, whether it's cosmetology, whether it's forestry, all of it can have its tedious moments and stressful and frustrating moments. So that's not unique to philosophy, but it's well worth knowing that such does exist in philosophy as well. And then perhaps most importantly is philosophy people don't back up. They ask questions and give answers and things that sometimes will run completely contrary to potentially how you've been seeing the world most of your life. And it can fundamentally change the way you see things and understand things. Some people don't enjoy that process. Philosophy does that all the time. It's not out of being mean. It's just if you're going wherever you think that truth may be, sometimes you're going to trample over stuff that people hold near and dear. Sometimes you're going to explore domains that people may wish you'd never even looked into or talked about or thought about. Sometimes we learn things that once we see something or hear it or learn it, we can't unsee it, we can't unhear it, we can't unlearn it. And that's always a risk doing philosophy. Is I've had those moments where I would be engaged in it and reading an author, and all of a sudden they're talking about things, and it just changes the way I see a lot of things. And that happens. Philosophy people tend to love that stuff. It's not, even if it's unpleasant, it's a new way of thinking about things, and maybe we add into what we already knew, and we're able to go forward even more. But it can be disorienting, it can be disturbing. And so that's just a risk. But that can happen in science and other places too. But it definitely can happen in philosophy. So it's just something to know about. Finally, there's a quote from the Apology. This is Socrates' defense when he was on trial. We will read the whole of the Apology later this semester and talk about it. But it gives you a sense. I mean, also now, and given that, it's down here and it says poverty. One thing about philosophy, one of the cons, sometimes with people is they say, well, how can I get a job doing that? Well, you can do, I've worked in it for 25 years or more. Most of the time you teach. That's what you do. You teach it, you work with it, or you can do research in it and get paid to do that. But moreover, with philosophy, the way of analysis and argumentation, it's a skill that you can do whatever you need or want with it. That if you want to be a high-powered stock trader, well, it does not hurt to be able to analyze extremely complex systems, and philosophy gives you that ability in its own unique way. You can learn something from doing software development too, but that's a different sort of analyzing complex systems than what philosophy is doing. So philosophy will do whatever, you can do with it things. It's not like philosophy immediately just hands you a job. If you want to teach it, you want to work in it, there's jobs available. But normally what happens is people learn philosophy to enhance what they're doing in some other domain. But it's well worth it. It's been very valuable to me, but it doesn't immediately give you a paycheck. That's potentially a con for some people. Now, I hope that this handout and this video, I've jumped over pieces of it and parts of it, but what I hope that this does is gives you a sense of what's going on in the handout at a large scale, and that I hope that some of it has been helpful. But if you have questions about it, just let me know. Then I'll do my best to answer them, and we'll go from there. Until next time.